Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We're just going to hang on for another 1 or 2 minutes as people are still joining. So we'll be back with you shortly to begin the webinar. Okay, well, once again, thank you for joining today's webinar. This afternoon, we will be hosting a IBM Audit Defense Experts Workshop. This webinar is produced and presented by Fisher ITS, live from a very hot and sunny United Kingdom this afternoon. Thank you to everybody who has joined so far. My name is Ben Eagling. I'll be joined on today's webinar by my colleagues Katerina Motlova and Eric Chu. In terms of housekeeping, all of the attendees today will be placed on mute. If you have any questions, and I hope you do, with the nature of this being a workshop, please enter them into the questions panel, which you should see on the interface in front of you. Thank you to everybody who has pre-submitted a question as part of the registration process. We'll be going through those today. In terms of the agenda for today, we'll do a brief introduction to Katerina and Eric, and also Fisher ITS, just so you know who we are. Katerina will run a very quick update of the latest news in the world of IBM, which we hope will be interesting for you. We have some quick content just to recap on the general auditing process and some high-level tips about IBM and how to defend an IBM audit, but we hope the real value for today will be for you to get your questions answered on IBM audits or IBM licensing in general. So please do make use of the questions panel. This is a really great opportunity in an end-user only environment for you to ask those questions on IBM and get a really well-informed answer from the IBM specialists we have here at Fisher ITS. Okay, Kat, if you wouldn't mind just moving to the next slide, please. Okay, so I will hand over to Katerina just to introduce herself first, and then Eric after that. So Kat, would you like to give a quick introduction?
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Katerina Motlova, and I am a senior manager in Fisher ITS. I am responsible for all of the projects which has something to do with IBM. So that means the IBM Audit Defense, which we provide for our customers as well. I actually started my SAM career in IBM. I worked for IBM for about 4 years as a part of their global services team, where we delivered basically SAM services to big customers of IBM. And then once I left IBM, I joined Fisher about 5 years ago, a little bit over 5 years ago. And I've been working on the IBM portfolio ever since.
Thanks, Kat. And Eric, are you there as well?
Yes. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Okay.
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Chu. I am the Managing Director for Fisher ITS. I kind of co-started the practice with H.W. Fisher, a London-based accountancy firm, about 8 years ago. My previous background was actually an IBM auditor, so I was working for one of the big four firms and helped them launch the IBM compliance program in the UK and Ireland back in the sort of early 2000s until I switched sites and joined Fisher. So over the past couple of years, working very closely with Katrina to help IBM customers managing their audits, typically from a big four firm, and happy to share any of all of my experiences today to answer your questions.
Thanks, Eric. Kat, could you just move ahead a slide again, please? Eric, would you like to do the honours for a quick introduction to Fisher ITS?
Absolutely. So, yes, who we are. So, what we do is we are a software asset management consultancy and services company, and basically what we do can be broken down into three pillars. The first pillar is what we call the 360 item, which is basically more kind of strategic advisory about software asset management processes, maturity, governance, etc. And then we do a lot of work in renewal support, audit defense, etc. And that's our bread and butter, licensing advisory services. And lastly, we also provide many services, so regular reporting, license management, typically leveraging SAM tools for our clients on an ongoing basis as well. So in a nutshell, that's kind of who we are and what we do.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, next step then is to hand over to Katerina, who will be leading most of this webinar. Kat, if you'd like to move ahead, and I think it's the IBM update coming up first, if memory serves. Great, over to you, Kat, thank you.
Thanks, Ben. So we thought that it would be good to have a look at some of the very recent IBM news that are happening in the industry. So we pinpoint 2 points in this case. So first one is that very recently IBM introduced a version of ILMT, IBM License Metric Tool, which some of you might be familiar with. IBM actually introduced a new version, which is called ILMT Lite. So what is ILMT Lite? It is presented by IBM as an alternative to the full ILMT and BigFix infrastructure. So the current IBM License Metric Tool has to have a portion of BigFix infrastructure underlying the ILMT. So basically BigFix is the technology which is scanning the devices and collecting the data which ILMT needs to calculate the usage. For ILMT Lite, the need for having BigFix infrastructure is being removed, and it is replaced by the use of disconnected scanners, which are run regularly on your devices to discover software and hardware information. So you don't have to worry about the whole BigFix infrastructure, and you can forget about that. There are some conditions when you can consider using ILMT Lite instead of the full ILMT. One of the conditions that IBM is putting down is there is a limit of up to 100 computers in your environment. So it's clear that ILMT Lite is meant for very small deployments where maintaining the full ILMT and BigFix infrastructure can be a little bit too cumbersome for the customers. So this is IBM's take on making ILMT a bit more accessible for smaller customers. One thing that needs to be taken into consideration in this case is that the disconnected scanners needs to be run on a regular schedule, and sometimes they might require a manual input to collect the data. So it can be a slightly more manual work than if you have BigFix. So that is something to consider if you are wondering if ILMT Lite might be the good solution for you. The option is there. It's meant for small deployments, but it is kind of like what you give and what you take. You don't have to worry about BigFix, but you do have to make sure that your disconnected scanners are running smoothly and all the information is being collected on a regular basis. Another news, which is not much of a news at this point in time, is that at the end of 2020, IBM introduced that they will be creating a spin-off company, which is called Kyndryl. And this is basically replacing IBM's Managed Infrastructure Service division, which was delivering services to IBM's customers. And it was one of the divisions of IBM. Now this whole infrastructure is moving away. and IBM created a new company, or it was created a new company, which is called Kyndryl. Kyndryl is publicly traded independent company, and it should be completely independent on IBM by the end of 2021, or at least that's the plan that IBM and Kyndryl announced at the beginning of this year. It is still not really clear what is going to be the relationship between IBM and Kyndryl. One of the documents which they released states that they will remain each other's biggest client and one of each other's key strategic partners. So this is obviously a bit of a question which we'll see in the near future, what the relationship really look like. And it's going to be interesting to see how Kyndryl's existence is going to affect the IBM's audit program, and also what will be the position of Kyndryl customers using IBM products. Because one of the information that Kyndryl released is that they will be offering IBM products and IBM related services to their customers, so that doesn't change. It's still very much IBM centric, but obviously it is an independent company, or it will be an independent company. So it's going to be interesting to see how this is going to change the way IBM performs audits, especially for huge Kyndryl customers, which are focusing on having their SAM services taken over by Kyndryl. So this is going to be something which is probably going to be very interesting to see how this turns out.
Thanks, Kat. Quick question from one of our guests on IBM Lite. Could you just clarify if that is 100 computers with IBM software or 100 servers total? For example, this current client has 5 servers currently reporting to ILMT, but have 800 servers in total.
So this is actually not clear in the documentation which IBM released so far for ILMT Lite. The wording that they used is up to 100 computers in the environment. And it does not specify if we're talking about the IBM portion of the environment or if it's the environment in total. I believe that this might be 100 computers in the full environment, so out of the complete number. But I think that this is going to be, as more and more people are talking about ILMT Lite and more people are interested in having this in their estate, this might be something that IBM will have to specify. So from my perspective, I think what they mean is a full limit for all computers in the estate, but the wording that they released is not very clear on that.
Yep. Kat, I just want to echo you because it's not kind of crystal clear, but my guess is the same as yours. It's purely because all this is manual, right? It's disconnected scanner, so you have to basically run it manually on each of the individual IBM servers. So you can't really expect to run that on 100 IBM servers. So my guess is my interpretation at the moment is that's basically 100 computers in the entire environment, not just IBM computers. And in that particular client, where you have 5 IBM machines, but then more than 100 computers, I wouldn't risk it at this moment. Of course, it's possible to seek clarification from IBM, yes, but that will introduce other risks as well, which we'll discuss later in the webinar.
Super. Okay, Kat, on with the audit process.
Okay, so in case you are lucky enough that you've actually never been through an IBM audit, we just want to talk quickly through the basic process about what's happening before you receive audit, let's say what's happening after and what's happening at the end. Normally the timeline of the event is that it starts with the target selection. This is based on multiple conditions, so it depends on when was your last audit, what is the amount of money that you spent on IBM products, if there was any change in your estate. So for example, if you reduced or increased the number of licenses which you purchase or support from IBM, if there was any acquisition in your company. So anything like that can trigger the audit interest from IBM's perspective. but they also have a pretty much, let's say, time frame within they aim to audit each of their customers. The time frame differs a little bit based on the size of the customers, but it usually goes between 2 to, let's say, 5 years. If you're a very small customer, then it might be longer than 5 years. But from what we've seen in the industry, that's pretty much the sort of cycle that IBM uses. So once the target is selected, then IBM will send you a notification letter. Normally, this is a PDF letter sent to a contact which you have with IBM, which is basically stating that IBM selected you for a compliance verification and what will be the next steps. So usually they propose to have a scoping meeting or a call where you will be talking about the product scope for the audit, timeline for the audit as well, and basically that is considered to be the initiation of the whole audit process. So once the scoping is done, you should know which products exactly are in scope, what is the timeline, also what is the timeline for the data which you need to provide to IBM. So you should clarify with IBM, or they should tell you if they're looking back a year, 2 years, year and a half, and you know, what is the reason for the timeline as well. Once this is agreed and the audit is officially initiated, then you're moving into the data collection stage. So IBM will issue, or the auditors will issue instructions to which data needs to be collected for which product. If you have ILMT, the ILMT is going to be one of the sources that they will be asking you for. There are also some other questions which are product specific or product family specific. So based on these instructions, you will be asked to provide information to IBM. Usually this is provided into an online repository, which they will set up for you, which will be set up for you by the auditors. Once that is done and the data is collected, then basically the auditors will work on the data and produce a draft report, which will be provided to you as a customer for checking of accuracy and for confirmation. So you will be expected to have a look at the report and basically point out any discrepancies or any misunderstandings which might be in the report. Maybe the auditors misunderstood the data that you provided to them, or maybe they included something that should not be included. So this kind of goes back to the product scoping and the timeline as well. So when the draft report is provided to you as a customer, you are expected to check all of these things and either say, we do not agree with point ABC, or yes, this looks good enough to us, and confirm it. And then you're moving into the settlement discussion. One thing which is quite important here to realize is that the process will or might move to the settlement discussion even if you don't agree on the report, even if you don't confirm the accuracy of the report. So if there are things which you don't think are correct and the auditors are not willing or not able to update them in the report, you can basically agree to disagree and say, okay, we agree on 80%, 20% of that we do not agree on, but we want to move forward. We want to, we don't want to have this discussion anymore. So you might be moved into settlement discussion even without agreeing specifically to 100% of the reporting. And once you get into the settlement discussion, there is usually a first meeting which is done between you as the customer, IBM, and their chosen auditor, and which is basically like a handover meeting. Once that is done, normally the auditors will withdraw from the discussion, and it's just between the customer and IBM. It is basically discussion about what were the issues that the auditors found in the report, if you agree with them or not, and what are the possible settlement scenarios that would be acceptable to you and to IBM as well. So that's very broadly described the usual audit timeline. Sometimes, for some cases, this whole process might take months and months. Sometimes it might take a month or two to go from notification to settlement discussion. It depends on how big your estate is. If you have any questions, if you have any questions or any information which you would like to have included in the report, also if you have any disagreements with IBM on what is actually in the report. So we've seen audits which were closed very swiftly, and we've also seen audits which lasted for almost years, I would say. This is very, very broad timeline and need to be applied to your specific situation, of course.
Thanks, Kat. We have a couple of questions from the audience on that subject. So to begin with, what is the criteria for IBM to select a customer for an audit?
So they tend to go in a regular circle based on the size of the customer. So basically, even if you are a small customer, being a small customer basically means that you will be audited less frequently, but it doesn't mean that you will not be audited at all. So it means that your audit might come once every 6-7 years, let's say, but it doesn't mean that IBM forgot about you completely, right? So size of your estate is one thing. How much money you spend on IBM every year or every 3 years, that's important, because that gives IBM sort of the opportunity to assess that if you spend only a few £1,000s on your IBM estate, then the estate is not going to be very big, which also means that the potential for having some non-compliance is much smaller than in a situation when you spend £5 million every 3 years to renew your contract with IBM. Obviously, that is much bigger a number. So it also means that there is much more opportunities for non-compliance. So the size of your estate is definitely one thing. Also, as we've seen in the past, any changes to the infrastructure of the company. So whether you sold a division or you acquired another company, or maybe your company is making a huge move from on-prem to cloud, all of these changes, which can potentially mess up your compliance situation, can be triggers for IBM to bump you up in the list and basically say, yes, they acquired a new company 6 months ago. Let's go into an audit and see how they dealt with the licenses, how they dealt with the increased usage. Let's see how the company managed to sort of combine software asset management for those things. So those are the most common triggers.
Okay. Does the contract allow for IBM partners to conduct the audit, and should that be acceptable to a customer?
Yes. So the Passport Advantage contract specifically says that when when the customer is agreed to purchase a product from IBM, you're also agreeing to having the compliance verification performed by either IBM or one of their partners. So it is specifically stated in the documentation which is binding when you purchase any of the IBM products, and it specifically mentions the partners. It doesn't mention them by name, but it says that it can be either IBM or the partners which are performing the audit. And as we saw in the past, it is almost exclusively IBM partners which are conducting the audits.
Thank you. And finally, is there a limit on scoping? When this customer had their last audit, IBM wanted 10 years of historical data.
Well, that's very excessive. So based on the documentation, and this goes especially for ILMT, you as a customer have to have at least 2 years of reporting history. Anything beyond that is basically not in the documentation, which is binding to you as a customer and can be discussed with IBM, of course. So 10 years is quite excessive. And if IBM is requesting 10 years, they better have a very good reason for that. But the sort of requested maximum time frame is 2 years, which is included in the Passport Advantage agreement. So unless you have something else in your specific contract, in your ESSO or SSSO, any contract which would be just specifically between you and IBM, I would say anything over 2 years of time, that should be a very good reason why IBM is asking for extended time frame for the data.
Thank you. There was actually one more that's come in as a follow-up to the partner question that you answered. So if the customer finds out that the partner is also a licensed reseller, can they object to it in that case?
So you can try to object, but as we know, both of the partners which are currently working with IBM to perform their audits, which is Deloitte and KPMG, as far as I'm aware, they are both licensed resellers. So I do not think that based on the documentation, and this is going into very sort of legal aspect of what is exactly written in the documentation, I don't think that the fact that they are licensed resellers should affect that situation in any case, because the documentation specifically states that the customer is agreeing for the IBM partners to conduct the audits should IBM choose so, and it doesn't really say if they can or could not be licensed resellers. So I think this is probably up for discussion, but IBM actually doesn't have that many partners which would be conducting the audits, so it's not like they can choose from 10 or 15 companies. It is mainly Deloitte and KPMG or IBM's internal teams which are performing the verification.
Great, thanks. There's a couple more bits coming, but I think we'll move to the next section, and anything unanswered currently, we'll answer them in the general Q&A following the next bits.
Yep, sounds good. Yeah, so here we have a bit more information about how the audits normally look like, what you can expect, also some tips for the audit itself and for the settlement. So as we said, globally the audits are conducted by two partners, which is Deloitte and KPMG, and those are the IBM preferred partners in this case. The audit approach is quite intrusive, because for some of the license models, they are very complex, so there will be need to run scripts or provide some extra information on top of the discovery information, whether the discovery information is coming from ILMT or from other sources. There is usually need to provide some extra information like scripts, screenshots of license servers, so on and so forth. So that's why the partners are issuing the instructions, so you know exactly which information to collect. But it is usually a bit of a process to collect the data, and it might take a bit of time and resources as well. So the quality and the thoroughness of the audit varies between regions, and we've seen that Europe and US are historically being sort of the ones with the highest given maturity. The auditors, pretty much every single time when there's any issue, they will present the worst case assumption or the worst case scenario. This is to first of all sort of highlight this to you as a customer and highlight this to IBM, and also it helps to sort of maximize the potential exposure if the sufficient data is not collected during audit, or if they found any issues with your deployment. Usually the first draft of the report, which you're going to get from the auditors, can be quite scary, huge numbers, huge exposure, but it's all sort of part of the tactic that IBM partners and IBM uses to start with the highest possible number, so they can take this number into the negotiations. For customers with enterprise agreements, very often the audit can happen before your renewal date, and this is just purely to sort of secure a bit of a bigger multi-year agreement. IBM very often in this case will offer you to sort of convert the exposure into prepaid value pots. So these are known as CBA, which is cross-brand allotment or substitution clause. And this is basically to, first of all, to increase the value of the agreement, and also to make you as a customer to feel that you are actually not paying a compliance penalty, that you are sort of getting the worth of your money. But obviously, it is one of the tactics which IBM uses to get more money from you as a customer. When we talk about tools, so we've already mentioned ILMT. ILMT is compulsory for subcapacity licensing. If you have any experience with ILMT, you know that sometimes it can be a bit of a struggle to make sure that it is accurately configured and maintained. So if there are any issues with the configuration or maintenance of the system, even if you have ILMT but it's not working properly, it may still trigger the full capacity penalty. So even though you have ILMT in your system, once you get the draft report from the auditors, you can still see full capacity numbers if there are some issues with the system. There are some tools which can integrate with ILMT, but the quality is very variable throughout the market. So Flexera is one of them, and Flexera can actually potentially replace ILMT altogether, but you need to have authorization from IBM. So even if you have other SAM tool, it is quite likely that you will still have to keep and maintain ILMT on the side, because that's the preferable tool that IBM uses. We've already mentioned the frequency, so there is no official definition of the frequency in any of the documentation which is available, but internal policy is basically, or used to be, we'll see how things change now, it was to have an audit for the same customer no more often than once every 2 years. So if you had audit in the last 2 years, then you can just basically use the sort of 2 years threshold, as in, now we are entering the time where IBM might be interested to come and do an audit again. So a few tips for the audit and settlement. As we mentioned, ILMT is compulsory for subcapacity licensing. And subcapacity versus full capacity is usually the largest non-compliance which is reported by the auditors. So sometimes it can be up to 80% of the exposure, which is valued in the draft report that you're going to get from your auditors, just caused by the difference between subcapacity and full capacity. So it's really, really important to make sure that you are following all the rules that IBM is putting out to make sure that ILMT is in a good shape and you are actually still eligible for subcapacity, because the difference is huge. And normally this is one of the main things which is being pointed out in the audit, and also pointed out and discussed and sort of fought in the settlement with IBM. It's also important to remember that while ILMT can help us with the PVU metrics or with the hardware-based metrics, there are loads of other metrics which ILMT cannot work with. And that being said, no other SAM tool can really track them very efficiently, or at least it can't track them just out of the box. So we're talking about metrics like user, connection, terabyte, which can be quite easy to overuse because the control is sometimes a bit tedious, especially in a big organization. And as we said, to monitor them effectively can be a bit of a struggle. So these are sort of the two things for the PVU. Focuses on ILMT. For the non-PVU, focuses on kind of governance, let's put it this way. For the settlement, as we said, IBM is looking for ways to get more money from the customer, and it is better for them to provide, to get you to buy more licenses as part of the settlement instead of paying just sort of penalty fee. Because if you purchase more licenses as part of the settlement, then obviously that increases your overall spend on IBM, and also it increases your connection with IBM. Deployment goes up, and you are less likely to just ditch all of the IBM products in the future. So usually IBM is looking to provide you with new licenses as part of the settlement, But if you insist on paying just a cash settlement and say, we don't want any more products, we just want to pay you penalty and that's it, they will obviously take this as well, but they will heavily go for trying to show you that you can get a value out of the settlement by purchasing your product. You can also get discounts towards the end of quarter or end of the year, because that is sort of colliding with the terms that the compliance managers from IBM have. So let's say that you are at the end of quarter, and if your compliance manager hasn't hit their target, then they might be much more willing to give you a discount or be more willing to discuss what are the options for the settlement, just to make sure that even though the settlement is not going to be as big as they expected, they will get at least something towards the goal. So end of quarter, end of year, these are important times to remember that there is a pressure on your compliance managers from IBM as well to meet their targets. They're also very keen to make sure that the outcome of the settlement can be multi-year agreements, any Cloud Packs, FlexPoint, dual entitlements, things which are more flexible, but again, it means that you are increasing your dependency on IBM because your numbers go up, your IBM usage goes up, and that means that you're going to be spending more on IBM going forward. As far as we know, there is not really any situation where an IBM audit would end up in court. So we are not aware of any situation like that, at least not in Europe and in the US. So for all of the audits which IBM went through, the settlement was always reached. But obviously, times might be changing, so we'll see about that. Any questions to this slide?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I tell you what, the first one that I'll pick, and Eric might be good to answer this one, just to give you a rest for a second, Kat. So, Eric, can you just give us some idea of the magnitude of penalties that can be paid by a customer if an audit goes south? For instance, this attendee is just asking, is it likely that the customer would have to pay for all of the previous usage that was deemed to be non-compliant?
Ben, I think it's a good choice. I enjoy answering this question all the time. It's probably one of my favorite questions. The biggest numbers I've seen is in excess of 100 millions in each of the currencies. I've seen one in dollars, US dollars, one in euros, and another one in pounds sterling. So that's the sort of the biggest size of the claim. And except one of those, the other two, they all came in sort of an informal way. Because IBM tend to be reluctant to put these down on a paper. What they would do is to say, hey, looking at the KPMG or Deloitte report, we've done some initial calculations, and this is going to be 120 million euros worth of exposure. And this is basically what they're telling you. That's the starting line of the negotiation. In practice, how much customer settle, the line's becoming a little bit blurry because in 95% of the cases that I'm aware of, IBM will not take a so-called penalty-only fee. They will always ask you to basically use that liability to purchase software instead. So I think a fair way to look at this is sort of the largest forced purchase that I have been made aware of is in excess of 30 million pounds. So at the back of one audit, and then basically the customer had to buy 30 million plus of software that they actually do not require. So that's the worst case that I've ever been made aware of. So that's hopefully to give you sort of one indication of how bad things can go. Another way to answer this question is also looking at obviously if you're an IBM customer that only have 5 servers and I don't know spend £50,000 on IBM, your exposure is not going to go into the 100 millions mark. Typically, if your exposure or non-compliance caused by ILMT subcapacity you ended up basically having to pay 4 to 5 times more over your annual kind of normal annual commitment to IBM. So that's a kind of good indication of the average total exposure.
Thanks, Eric. Next one, let's just make this a quick one because we've got a few to go through. When does the IBM financial year end, and does that have a bearing on what time of year that you're more likely to get audited?
Sure, I'll do that one as well. The IBM financial year end, it's in sync with the calendar year end, like many of the US software publishers. I don't have the exact numbers with me now, but I think if you Google, you'll be able to find it. I think IBM software revenue, a big percentage, I think more than half the software revenue was booked, is typically booked on the 31st of December every year. So that basically shows you how desperate sometimes the sales team, the compliance team can get towards the end of the financial year to basically book the revenues in. So definitely the timing plays a big part of the settlement negotiation in terms of IBM. Year end, it's definitely the biggest kind of motivator, but calendar quarter end is also sort of the secondary motivator as well. So yeah.
Okay, to bunch a couple of similar questions up into one, can you just talk a little bit about how the scope of an audit is defined? For instance, is it always going to be all products? Can this be negotiated? Do the likes of KPMG and Deloitte have any say in what the scope of the audit will be?
Yeah, so I'm going to take this one. Normally or usually what the suggested scope is going to be your full IBM portfolio. But what you can do if you have reasons for that. So let's say that you have an IBM application which you are currently migrating to a different platform, or you are going through an upgrade or something like that. Those are reasonable requests to basically say, yes, we know that this is IBM product as well, but we are currently in a process of migration. This is going to take another 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year. So we do not think that now you would be able to get a realistic information about the usage, or if you have any other changes in your environment, like let's say you are maybe upgrading one of your vCenters or moving to a different provider, something like that. So these things can all be used to basically say, we would like to take these products out of the scope because of these things which are surrounding the situation of where these products are deployed, on how they are used. And we do not think that it would be, either doable for us as a customer to provide you reliable information, or even, fair to audit these at this point in time.
Thanks, Kat. We're heading into the Q&A session of the webinar now anyway, so I'll just continue with the last couple that we have from the live audience. Does a customer need a license for IBM for their IBM development and testing environments? How does an auditor usually approach this?
So generally speaking, yes. For testing and development, you need to have a license, but that is a very huge generalization. It depends product by product. For some of the products, IBM has a specific license which is meant for non-production, so that means testing and development. For some of the products, IBM does not have a specific license, but you still might be required to license your testing and development. So this depends on which products are we talking about. Also, what kind of testing and development is being done by the product. There are also some rules which can, even for the products where theoretically you should license your testing and development, there are also some rules which can basically exclude the specific deployment out of the licensing. This is mainly for backups. Where basically it depends on what type of backup you're running in your estate, and how often, and if the backup servers are online or not. So these are different rules that you can apply, but generally speaking, you should expect that your test and development will require at least partial licensing, if not full.
Okay, thank you, Kat. That's clear. Does IBM offer a parallel construct like an Oracle ULA, for example?
Sorry, Ben, what was that? Parallel constructs?
Yes, so does IBM offer anything akin to the Oracle ULA?
I think I'll probably give that one.
Yes,
I think,
go ahead.
Yeah, I think the parallel construct. I guess that's what I meant is basically an enterprise agreement that is not necessarily transactional. And the short answer is yes. Most of the large enterprise customers IBM will have some kind of enterprise agreement with IBM where you don't pay kind of for each individual licenses as and when you buy them. Instead, you negotiate a 3-year agreement, 5-year agreements in advance. And it is less often IBM include a unlimited use element of an enterprise agreement, but it does happen. Very often it's part of an enterprise agreement. IBM will say for a particular piece of software application or for a particular family of applications, you will have unlimited usage rights during the period of the enterprise agreement. And it's a very similar process. By the end of the enterprise agreement, you have to crystallize, basically self-declare your usage to IBM, and then crystallize those usages into license entitlements as and when the enterprise agreements end. So, that was the longer answer. The short answer is yes, IBM does offer enterprise agreement, and some of that has an unlimited usage element to it as well, similar to Oracle.
Thanks, Eric. And also another comparison to Oracle. Does IBM behave similar to Oracle and tries to diligently defend their annual support charges?
Yes, pretty much. Yeah. So lowering your support value or the amount of licenses that you support if the change is significant enough that it can actually be one of the audit triggers as well. Yes, IBM, just as Oracle, is focused on the revenue that they're getting from the support every year. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Customers, auditors, and SAM tools do not have visibility for non-PVU metrics usage. What is the approach of auditors when it comes to non-PVU metrics?
So for the non-BVU metrics, the audit is basically a point-in-time situation. So the data which will be provided and which are requested by the auditors can only be point-in-time situation. So for anything which is user-based, terabytes, some of the products can give you a little bit of a history. So some of the products are able to have logs and similar information, which can give the auditors a little bit of idea of what were the recent changes and when maybe some features were used last. But this doesn't apply to all of the products. So generally speaking, for everything which is not PVU and not monitored by LMT, it is always a point-in-time review. And that is also why it kind of requires loads of extra information by the auditors.
And I'll probably just add to this one because it's a very, very important question. I mean, in a nutshell, you can look at IBM audits into 3 parts, right? So you have the PVU related software, which is ideally should be all covered by ILMT. And then you have the non-PVU licenses, which it's very difficult to capture the usage. And then some customers will have the third part, which is the mainframe. And believe it or not, they are still around. And really, from an audit management, risk management point of view, the non-PVU stuff is the area where you can actually do quite a lot to reduce the risk, because the auditor typically will not or cannot seek historical information. So if you rectify any accidental deployments before the data was is released to the auditor, that can substantially reduce your exposure. This is in a contrast to ILMT, right? Because for ILMT, as Katrina mentioned, the auditor will always ask for 2 years back of data, and in ILMT. So if you haven't got ILMT working, or if your ILMT wasn't configured correctly, so the report was wrong, there is very little you can do to back fix it. You can obviously fix it then and make the future better, but you can't reproduce the history legally anyway. It wasn't there. So it is very important to pay attention to the non-PVU software, which can be very, very risky, depends on the license metric. And most of the non-specialized licensing consultants or same practices or tools, when it comes to IBM, their only focus is on PVU, right? So that's also why the auditors are actually focusing quite a lot on non-PVU, because they know that's the area that nobody touches, and that's where the monies are. But on the other hand side, this is where you can make a lot of savings.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, so let's quickly go through some of the questions that we had pre-submitted, Kat, and then we'll see where we are when we've done those ones.
Yeah, so this is just a summarization of what we talked about. So the useful tips for the audit is good housekeeping is key. If you know where things are and who uses them, then you will be able to check the usage, basically as simple as that. Another thing which loads of customers are kind of forgetting is make sure that you are familiar with your contract. So whether it is a customer specific contract like ESSO or it's Passport Advantage, make sure that you read the contract and you understood what are the instruments in the contract, and if there might be something which is beneficial for you as a customer. So for example, the substitution port or CBA, that is something which can save you money in short term and long term as well. ILMT should be in a good shape. I think that's pretty much a no-brainer. Also, be mindful of what is reasonable to request during an audit. As we said, loads of information is being requested for the PVU and non-PVU products as well. But it's important to remember that you are the gatekeeper of your information. And just because the auditors are asking these questions, are asking this data, it doesn't mean that you need to provide them or you need to provide them no questions asked. So make sure that you understand what they're asking, what kind of information they're asking for, and make sure that you understand sort of what is the correlation with the product and with the usage of the product. If not, feel free to ask questions to the auditors. They are here to explain these information to you because you're giving them your data. And also take your time. Don't be rushed when it comes to audit request and the data request, and ask for help if needed. Right. So let's have a look at some of the questions which we had submitted beforehand. So the first one is, what internal checks or reviews should we do before an audit? This varies greatly customer from customer, but I would definitely say identify which ones of the products are the most risky ones and also the most expensive ones. So identify the products you spend most of your IBM budget on, and that should be your focus to make sure that these are all in order. And also identify the products where, or even the parts of your infrastructure where you don't really have that much of visibility. So let's say if you know that ILMT is, up and running and you pay reasonable attention to it, that's great. Maybe your focus should be on the non-PVU products then. Maybe it should be the user-based and the terabyte-based products where you don't have such great visibility, and there might be some things which can bring you huge numbers in the report later on. So this kind of differs customer to customer, but as we said, good housekeeping is very, very important. And if you do not have time to check everything, ideally you would like to check everything in your estate, every single IBM product which you purchased and deployed. Ideally you would like to check those. Sometimes you don't have time for that. So focus on the big money items and also the items where you are a bit worried and you feel like you do not have enough control. Anything up to that, Eric?
I think that's pretty comprehensive already, right. So that's fine. Yeah.
Alrighty. So a bit more information about IBM's all or nothing rule. How do we ensure we are compliant on this? So if you're not familiar, IBM's all or nothing rule is related to the support and subscription and the usage. So IBM is basically saying that the number of entitlements which are under active support and subscription should be equal or higher to the number of entitlements that you're using. So to put it very bluntly, you either need to support all of the entitlements which you're using. So let's say if you have 50 users of Cognos, you need to have support for all 50 licenses which these users consume, or you can't have support for any of those licenses. So all or nothing. If you are in a situation where you have support for, let's say, 30 licenses and you have 50 users of the product, that's the discrepancy that IBM is going to highlight, or the auditors are going to highlight in the report. And then IBM might request for you to purchase something which they call a reinstatement of the support and subscription for those 20 licenses which are being used. The all or nothing rule is quite simple, and that is just basically because support and subscription give you access to technical support and upgrades as well. So by requesting that you support all of the licenses which you have deployed, IBM just basically make sure that you do not use the access to these benefits for just part of your estate, and just basically apply the upgrades and the technical support and all of that on instances which are not supported. So that's the reason why we are talking about all or nothing. To ensure that you're compliant on this, you need to have an overview of your usage. So you need to make sure that there is some sort of control in place, so either ILMT for the PVU product, or other ways to control the usage for the non-PVU products. And also you need to be aware what is your current support and subscription level for all of the products, where you want to check if you're compliant on the all or nothing rule. Is it true that the renewal of inactive support for perpetual licenses can only be done with vendor where we purchased the licenses? So as far as I'm aware, I don't think this is true. You can purchase your licenses from whichever reseller or vendor you want. Obviously, they need to be able to give you the right licenses. They need to be able to sell them to you. But as far as I'm aware, that should not be a limit that if you bought your licenses from a certain reseller, you will have to keep buying support for those licenses from that specific reseller. If you really bought perpetual licenses, they are yours, and you can choose to do whatever you want with them, right? So you can stop paying the support altogether, or you can move to a different provider which can give you a better price. There should not be any limit in that. Eric, do you have any other information?
No, that's pretty good. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Let's move on. Okay. So a little bit more about IBM Cloud Packs and how they are audited. So as far as we know, Cloud Packs are actually no different to any other products in the IBM portfolio. IBM Cloud Packs can actually be monitored by ILMT. So that's one of the things which is quite important. So any of the Cloud Packs which are licenses via VPC, which is Virtual Processor Core, these can be monitored and calculated by ILMT. So if you do have products deployed which you want to cover by Cloud Pack licenses, it is very, very important to make sure that you have ILMT covering those devices, and also that your ILMT is reflecting that these products are licensed by Cloud Packs. So there is a setting which you can do in your ILMT, which is going to introduce to say that these specific products on these specific devices are covered either by FlexPoints and Cloud Packs. And if you do that, ILMT is actually going to do the conversion for you. So it's very, very beneficial to do that. ILMT is going to do the conversion of the Virtual Processor Core for each of the products against the number of licenses which you have for that specific Cloud Pack. So that's one thing which is very important to remember. For Cloud Packs, ILMT is definitely needed. If you do have Cloud Packs in containerized environment, there is also a way how to measure the usage. This is called license service, and it's basically slimmed down ILMT. If you think about it, it gives you reporting for the containers on a cluster level. So even if you have dynamic environment in containers and you want to deploy some of the Cloud Pack products, there is a way how you can monitor this. And also there is a way how IBM can audit you on this. So this is important to remember that virtual processor core is also subcapacity eligible license metric.
Thanks, Kat. We've just hit the top of the hour. So for the people who need to leave us now, thank you very much for joining. Thank you for all the questions today. And we have plenty of further information on IBM and indeed all of the other major vendors on our website. So please feel free to visit fisherits.com and hit the news and resources section to access any of that. And of course, should you be in the need of any help, consultancy around your IBM licensing or indeed any other vendors, please feel free to get in touch and we can talk about how Fisher ITS can help you. Kat, do you, I can see we have a few more questions and I think there may be a couple more in the deck. Do you have a few moments to finish these, and we will continue the recording, and for anybody who has to leave, we will issue the recording tomorrow as well. Is that okay with you, Kat?
Yep, yeah, absolutely, that's fine.
Super. Okay, are there any more on the slide deck before we go back to the live questions?
Yes, I think I have one or two more. So
let's
yeah,
cover
so
those.
This is actually the last one in the deck, so then we can go into the live ones.
Okay.
So the last one, sorry.
Sorry, carry on, Kat.
Okay. So how to negotiate the best settlement if you don't have ILMT installed and historical ILMT report. So this is actually happening quite often, especially for smaller customers. Even for bigger customers, if you're not aware of having ILMT, or maybe there was a mismatch in communication with your service provider, this can happen, right? So one of the important things is, as soon as you realize that you do not have ILMT, and you should have ILMT because you want to be subcapacity eligible, you need to deploy ILMT as soon as possible. Because what is going to help you in the negotiation is to basically show IBM then, yes, we made a mistake, we didn't know that ILMT is needed, we did not have ILMT. However, as soon as we realized that this is a requirement, we tried to rectify this, right? We deployed the system, and even if you can say, oh, we've actually deployed ILMT as soon as we realized that we need it, and we have month or 2 months of reporting, even that can be helpful in the negotiations, because you can show to IBM that you are trying to rectify these things and you are trying to stay focused and stay compliant going forward. So this is very important to sort of rectify this issue straight away, because you will need ILMT anyway. Also, what is quite handy is that if you have any other records which can basically show what is the virtual CPU assignment to the virtual machines where IBM is claiming full capacity, that can help you as well. IBM and the auditors are very likely to basically say, well, if it's not ILMT, we do not trust it. But if you have information from your service provider, or if you have any regular reporting which is showing the assignment of the virtual CPUs for those specific machines, that can also help you to basically show to IBM, yes, we did not have ILMT. However, we have these reports which were produced every month, every 3 months, and you can see that for the past 2 years, or for as much time as you have those reports, our assignment stayed the same, and we actually didn't go over the usage that we have. So this is very important to sort of try to, first of all, get ILMT up and running as soon as possible. Even a little reporting is better than nothing when it comes to the settlement. And also, if you have any other information regarding your virtual deployment, excuse me, that's going to be helpful as well.
Great. So that's all the pre-submitted questions done. So we have a few more coming in from the audience, Kat, so I'll just fire away. I think it'll be all
Yep.
IBM by the end of the day, but here we go. So does a customer need a license for their disaster recovery setup?
So it depends what how the disaster recovery is set up. So as we said before, basically it also depends what kind of product you have on the disaster recovery service. So this can be different product to product. For some of the products, IBM says, yes, disaster recovery needs to be covered as well. For some of them, IBM might be a bit brilliant, especially for the PVU products. They can basically say, well, it depends, right? So are those servers online, or what needs to happen for the disaster recovery service to come online? Is it automatic? Do you have any records about, how many times it happened in the last 2 years? So it depends. There is no straight answer, yes or no. It depends what's deployed. It depends what kind of disaster recovery you have, how is it set up. But if you can provide a proof to IBM to say that, our disaster recovery requires somebody to flip a switch, or, some sort of manual activity, for example, to be done before those servers will come live. And we have notes that this hasn't happened in the past 2 years, 3 years, or how many months or time that you can provide. That can be a strong argument to say the disaster recovery service should not be licensed and should not be counted as part of the licensable deployment in your estate as part of the audit.
Okay, thank you. Question from a customer. Does a customer have the option to negotiate the IBM IPLA or contracts as per our product's usage?
Sorry, IBM ITLA?
So does the customer have the option to negotiate the IBM IPLA / contracts?
Oh, IPLA.
Yeah, as per our product's usage.
Yeah, so IPLA or Pass Per Advantage contracts, they are set contracts. They are non-negotiable. They are basically as they are written, and they apply to all customers. But in a situation where your IBM spend is over a certain amount, IBM might be willing to give you your customer-specific contract. So that would be ESSO or a similar contract. So if you are in a position where you're spending loads of money on IBM, then you can basically request from IBM to say, we do not want to be binded by these general contracts. We want to have our own contract, which is basically going to say, this is a contract between customer and IBM, and these are the conditions. If you have customer-specific contract, that it basically supersedes all of the general contracts. So Pass Per Advantage and IPLA, they will not be applicable if your customer-specific contract says something else. So yes, there is an option to negotiate your own contract with IBM rather than being binded by the general ones.
Okay. The next point is more of a comment than a question, Kat, but perhaps you could give your remarks on this. So a customer was able to pull a report from SCOM confirming no hardware changes ever on the virtual machines, and they would not accept that. We also had RV tools, VM report for every week. They would not accept that either. So that's a scenario that customers had during an audit. Do you have any remarks on that?
Yeah, so this is one of the situations where you do not have ILMT, but you are able to provide other resources. So it comes down to the negotiations, really, and it comes down to sort of what else can IBM get out of the audit. So strictly speaking, every IBM customer is agreeing to the conditions which state that for if you want to be subcapacity eligible, you need to have ILMT. That's pretty simple. But there is a bit of a gray area about sort of what subcapacity is and how it is calculated, because the wording that IBM uses is that for subcapacity, you need to have you need to have licenses for all of the virtual CPUs which are being made available to that specific product. And it is not really explained what IBM means by made available, right? So this is very similar to soft partitioning, hard partitioning for Oracle, right? So technically, you might be able to show this was the assignment of the virtual CPUs for these machines for the past 2 years. We have a report from every week, and you can see that this hasn't changed. But it is true that IBM is requesting you to have ILMT to have this information. So it very much comes down to the negotiations, and sort of what IBM can get out of that negotiation apart from the subcapacity versus full capacity. So I would say if you have information like that, it's definitely worth to push against IBM and say, well, we think this is, good enough, and if not, explain to us what you mean by made available. Normally, the compliance managers are not really willing to do that because they know that it's a bit of a gray area. So I would say that if you are persistent enough, there might be a good chance that you will be successful, but it very much depends on the specific case.
Okay, last one we have outstanding currently, unless any more come in. How is the licensing impacted for cold, warm and hot environments? I presume this is related to disaster recovery rather than the temperature in UK offices today, which is definitely hot. Any remarks on that, Kat?
Yes, so there is actually a policy from IBM which is related to the PVU product in this case. So for the PVU products, IBM basically has a bit of a rule of thumb, let's say, and this can be found online if you search for IBM backup policy, cold, hot, warm. You can find a document which is stating this, but generally speaking, for the PVU products, when the backup or disaster recovery is cold, and it needs to be cold based on the description how IBM describes a cold server or cold backup, you do not have to have licenses for those servers. If it's warm, then IBM suggests a flood charge of 100 PVUs per server. So it doesn't really matter, what type of processor those servers have, and you don't have to worry about PVU per core. It is 100 PVUs for each server. And if it's hot, then it needs to be licensed as any other normal deployment. So, and this is related to the PVU products only on those servers.
Okay, well, thanks very much. That's answered everything that we have outstanding, Katerina. Definitely go and get a glass of water and lie down after that one. It's quite an intensive session, but thank you very much for everybody who's asked questions as well. That's obviously what really brings value to this kind of webinar. We'll be hosting similar sessions in the future as well. You can see on screen there's a suggested resource available on our website, which is our Audit Survival Guide. Please feel very free to go to the website and get hold of that. But there are plenty of other pieces of content, resources, white papers, blogs, videos on there, which you should find really useful. Of course, if you would like some professional help with IBM, this can be audit defense. If it is audit defense, it is nearly always best to try and engage with an audit defense partner as soon as possible, because more can be done earlier in an audit to prevent a bad outcome than it can be towards the end. But this can also just be on contractual renewals, setup and maintenance of your ILMT, which is very helpful to a lot of IBM customers. But yes, please feel free to get in touch there. Thank you very much, Kat. Thank you very much, Eric. Really good session, and we will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, everybody, for joining. It was a pleasure.